Welcome to the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author session on enhancing the connectivity, sustainability and resilience of regional freight transport in Southeast Asia. This is the follow-up session from last week's session focusing on Central Asia. Today we are working with a similar methodology but different outputs for Southeast Asian countries, notably Thailand, Indonesia and the Philippines. I'm delighted to be joined today by our co-authors, Nick Caros from the ITF and Varun Shankar, who is a co-author of the report and an independent consultant from the Climate Policy Initiative. The aim of the Ask the Author today is to give you a very brief overview of what's a very complex multi-year project. It's a project that we are running in conjunction with the OECD, the Sustainable Infrastructure Programme in Asia. ITF has been asked to develop the transport aspect of this project using our in-house modeling capabilities. So it's a multi-year project which is coming to its end. These are the final outputs. We'll give you a brief overview of those outputs in a 10-minute presentation, and then it's your chance to ask our authors the questions. To do so, please use the Q&A, the question and answer window, which will help us to moderate as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nick Caros for a presentation of the report.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ronan. My name is Nick Caros, and I was fortunate enough to be the project manager for this exciting and in-depth study over the past 2 years. We've got a lot to cover, so let me just jump right in. Please. All right, so why is it important to study regional freight transport in Southeast Asia in particular? Well, for one, the region's growing really quickly, both in terms of population and economically. And we actually estimate that by 2050, we're expecting demand for freight transport in the region to more than double. And this will put major strain on the region's infrastructure and create major challenges for achieving the region's climate targets. And in addition, transport networks in the region are prone to disruption from climate impacts like the typhoons that we recently saw, unfortunately, strike in Vietnam. But existing infrastructure and policy frameworks are just not sufficient to deliver sustainable growth. So a new comprehensive approach is needed where connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience are all considered as part of the same holistic freight transport strategy. And our study contained 4 components: a regional overview, a conceptual methodology for analyzing freight transport, a survey of expert stakeholders in the region, and finally, forecasts of policy impacts using the ITF global freight model. And collectively, these components give a fairly broad evaluation of the challenges that are facing freight transport in Southeast Asia, and also contribute to detailed policy recommendations that I'll be sharing at the end of this presentation. So on the conceptual side, to build an efficient, sustainable, and resilient freight transport system, we have to focus on the 3 key pillars: connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience. Now, first, connectivity. Freight movements must be seamless, efficient, and well integrated both between transport modes and across borders. This requires things like physical connectivity, such as investing in railroads and ports, but also institutional connectivity, harmonized regulations between trading partners, for example, and finally, market connectivity. This is things like ensuring alignment between the logistics providers and the needs of their customers. The second pillar is decarbonization. We truly need to reduce emissions while keeping transport reliable and cost-effective. And then third, resilience. Transport networks that are resilient must withstand shocks, adapt to disruptions, and be able to recover quickly when disruptions do occur. But as you can see here in this perhaps overly complicated diagram, these pillars aren't independent. The diagram illustrates the complex relationships between connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience in freight transport. And what you can see with the green lines is that many factors do actually reinforce each other, but some of them also conflict, as shown with the red lines, creating the sorts of trade-offs that have to be carefully managed by policymakers. So I think the key takeaway is just that a balanced approach is really crucial. Policymakers should be designing freight systems that integrate all 3 pillars, maximizing the complementary benefits while managing the trade-offs effectively. And this is just one question from our expert survey, which was completed by over 200 stakeholders in 5 of the study countries. And here we're focusing on connectivity, but the survey identifies a range of challenges and preferred policy approaches. We can see here that cross-border connectivity and road transport are the biggest concerns in the region. And that makes sense. Border clearance times at land borders can often reach 10 hours or more. And regional roads are typically in poor condition in certain locations. But when it comes to addressing these challenges, the expert respondents were really eager to see more digitalized customs processes and documents to address those cross-border connectivity challenges. And we saw in Vietnam and Cambodia especially, they wanted to see road network expansion and upgrades because roads are their main mode of transport for trade with the other mainland countries in the region. So there's a lot of other questions in this report, and I really do encourage you to check it out. But these results from the survey ultimately helped us to develop our modeling scenarios and identify potential policy recommendations. So now I'll quickly share some of our model results, which forecast freight transport performance from 2025 out to 2050 across 3 different scenarios. And each of these scenarios is intended to be sort of a different plausible policy pathway that the region might follow. So business as usual just represents a baseline scenario where policies evolve naturally and a gradual adoption of decarbonization strategies like fuel economy standards and high-capacity vehicles occurs. Then the high ambition connectivity scenario, or HAC, is more ambitious. It focuses more on enhancing freight connectivity by expanding transport networks like highways and ports, improving border crossing clearance times, and reducing intermodal transfer delays. And then finally, the high ambition connectivity and decarbonization scenario, HACD, is even more ambitious yet, introducing strong sustainability measures like accelerating the shift to zero emissions trucks, rail electrification, and carbon pricing. And then finally, we have a resilience case study that explores how those different policy pathways might affect resilience to a major shock. And in this case, we considered flooding of port infrastructure due to extreme weather. So here's the first performance indicator for connectivity. And this looks at the cost per ton to move goods from Southeast Asia to global markets. And in this case, we're looking at the average transport cost to reach 60% of global GDP for goods starting in each of the Southeast Asian countries. Now, under the business as usual 2050 scenario, we see that average transport costs across the region are actually mostly stable relative to 2025, with slight increases in countries like Myanmar and Laos due to the higher pressure on these relatively underdeveloped networks. But in contrast, under the HAC and HACD scenarios, all Southeast Asian countries experience pretty significant cost reductions, up to 20% or more in some cases relative to business as usual. And it's especially helpful for countries that have the highest costs right now, like Indonesia, Myanmar, and Laos. But ambitious connectivity and decarbonization reforms also help countries that already have fairly efficient logistics networks, like Malaysia and Singapore. And this is a result of several key policies that are included in these 2 scenarios, including more efficient ports and border crossings, and electrification of road and rail fleets that ultimately leads to lower operating costs. And in all cases, the HACD scenario produces meaningful gains in global competitiveness. So these really highlight the value of coordinated strategies that combine infrastructure upgrades with soft measures like intermodal integration, digitalization, and decarbonization to reduce costs. Then, under the business as usual scenario, when we're looking at decarbonization, we see that freight-related emissions rise dramatically, resulting in about a 70% increase in well-to-wheel carbon emissions by 2050 compared to 2025. Now, this outcome just reflects the continuation of current practices with fairly limited adoption of cleaner fuels or efficiency improvements. And under this scenario, we can see that Indonesia's emissions are expected to double and other countries in the region grow in parallel. And so let me just be perfectly clear, even though freight transport is just one part of the economy, this outcome would make it effectively impossible for countries in the region to achieve their clearly stated and ambitious climate goals. We can see in the center chart here that connectivity measures have fairly little impact in the short term because they mostly focus on addressing bottlenecks. But between 2040 and 2050, the efficiency savings do begin to translate into lower carbon intensity, and emissions remain steady over that decade. The HACD scenario integrates decarbonization strategies like electrification and modal shift towards rail and inland waterways. And while emissions do still rise in the short term, several countries are already achieving an absolute reduction in emissions by 2040. And by 2050, we see emissions in decline across all countries in the region. So I think these results show 3 different things. 1, the status quo is not compatible with national goals. 2, the targeted policies that we recommend in our report can make a significant is really going to be required beyond what we've included in the connectivity and decarbonization scenario to get Southeast Asia on the path to net zero emissions. All right, then finally, here's just one example of how we can evaluate resilience. One way to think about resilience is flexibility. How easy is it to reroute shipments if a certain corridor or a certain transport mode becomes disrupted? And our modeling actually allows us to calculate the percentage of total freight that uses more than one mode, or in other words, the sort of degree of multimodality. And this is a good proxy for how easy it is to switch modes in the case of disruption, because the prevalence of multimodal shipments sort of implies the availability of efficient intermodal transfer facilities. And we can see that multimodality in the region is still quite low in the business as usual scenario, but it really jumps up to more than half of all international tons when connectivity-focused policies are included. And these policies might include investment in rail connections at ports and incentives for inland transport that are part of the HAC scenario. And then decarbonization kind of further boosts intermodality in Southeast Asia by encouraging a shift from road towards lower carbon modes like rail, inland waterways, and coastal shipping. So for my final slide, I just want to highlight how we translated the regional overview, the expert survey, and those modeling outputs into concrete, location-specific policy recommendations, both at the regional level and for our 3 focus countries. This is just a sample of the proposed infrastructure investments and soft measures that we've included to enhance connectivity, accelerate decarbonization, and strengthen resilience. Now, given the region's reliance on maritime trade, we do expect that addressing port congestion and emissions through things like increased capacity, better road and rail connections, and green port initiatives would be among the most impactful interventions. For inland transport, completing missing rail links on the mainland and expanding rail on the larger islands in the Philippines and Indonesia would really help to lower costs, reduce emissions, and provide a viable alternative to road transport in the case of disruption. So that's my best effort to capture a 2-year, very complex project in just 10 slides. But luckily, we've reserved the majority of the time today for some questions, and I really do look forward to exploring the details further in our Q&A. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of my ITF and OECD colleagues, our external contributors, the government of Germany, and especially our government partners in the region for making this project possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for having excellently completed an impossible task, of course, to summarize this project in only 10 minutes. But as Nick said, the aim of the game is to take as many of your questions as possible. To do that, please use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window. If you're following us on YouTube or on LinkedIn, use the link in those channels to, if you have a question to ask, to come into the Zoom meeting. So to get going, a question for Varun, who's the co-author of the report. This is clearly a very complex report with a lot of moving parts and different components, from the regional study to the stakeholder survey and the modeling forecasts. Can you talk to us a little bit about how each of those components were used to actually inform the very strong policy recommendations from the report?
Thank you, Ronan, for the question, and thank you, Nick, for the presentation and encapsulating the work within a 10-minute presentation. So with regards to the question, the recommendations in the study, they come from 3 strands of analysis, as Nick had pointed out. So there's the regional overview, the stakeholder survey, and then the modeling forecasts. And each of these provided distinct evidence, and together they shaped the policy recommendations that we have at the end of the report. So let me begin with the regional overview. This established the baseline for us. It showed us that rail is still a marginal mode in the region. For example, it only carries less than 5% of freight in most ASEAN countries. It also highlighted some of the critical bottlenecks, such as long queues at the Phoi Phet border crossing between Thailand and Cambodia, or it pointed out, for example, the heavy reliance on maritime transport in Indonesia's 17,000 islands, where ports and intermodal links are often underdeveloped. So these findings pointed us towards policies such as expanding rail and intermodal capacity, improving border infrastructure, and upgrading ports, as Nick had identified. Secondly, with the stakeholder survey, this added perspective of operators and policymakers on the ground, both public and private actors. 75% of the survey respondents were public actors and the remaining were private actors. And there were over 200 from 5 countries, as Nick had mentioned. An example is that, like, for example, respondents in Indonesia had rated their overall freight connectivity just a bit below the regional average. And that goes to show what the general perspective is of respondents on the ground. And across Southeast Asia, 71% of the respondents had prioritized reducing intermodal and border delays. However, only 31% of the public sector respondents had said that they currently have a policy that looks at reducing intermodal and border delays. Another example is 75% of the stakeholders had said that they want to take into consideration or are taking into consideration environmental impact assessments. But when digging deeper, only 18% of them had said that they use life cycle assessments, or 20% said that they use greenhouse gas modeling. Similarly, when we think about resilience, 63% of the respondents had identified that natural disasters are one of the most significant risks, but the same respondents also identified that only 44% of the respondents had identified that disaster preparedness policies were in place. So these numbers made it clear where there are existing policies, where the desired policies are from the respondents, and where the gaps are, and how we can make the recommendations to fill those gaps. Thirdly, with the modeling and the forecasts, this quantified the potential impacts of the different interventions that we can have. So they showed that, for example, halving border delays could reduce freight costs by up to 5% on major corridors. The results also showed that without new measures, freight transport CO2 emissions in the region will rise by more than 50% by 2050. I think that was one of the plots that Nick had showed. But by contrast, expanding rail and waterways in Cambodia and Thailand could reduce emissions by double-digit percentages compared to business as usual pathway. So these results helped us identify which policies would return the greatest, and taken together, these 3 strands informed the recommendations. And in short, the regional overview told us what the situation is. The survey showed us what the stakeholders experience and what they want. And then the modeling quantified to us what works best. And together they provided a strong foundation for the recommendations that are evidence-based and regionally very relevant.
Thanks very much indeed, Varun. I'll pop into the Zoom window again, a link to the final report, as well as the project page, where you can see more in-depth analysis, including those survey results that Varun is referring to. So don't hesitate to send your questions using the Q&A, the question and answer function in the window. There's a question on the regional versus national aspect of the project. While we have a regional overview, there's quite a difference in the actual policy recommendations at a national level. Can you give us an example, perhaps either of those 3 focus countries, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, of where the national context had a big influence or made quite a difference compared to what we are recommending? Who'd like to take that question? Varun.
Sure. Yeah, I can start, and Nick, please feel free to add. I think one of the strengths of the study is recognizing the diversity in Southeast Asia. So we looked at the regional perspective, but also the national context, particularly for Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, which were the focal countries of the study. So if I take, for example, the Philippines, the geography and climate exposure dominate in the Philippines. With over 7,000 islands, the freight depends heavily on maritime links and port infrastructure. And in the report, we note that the geography and exposure to typhoons floods and sea level rise make resilience a critical consideration for freight transport planning. And the stakeholders in the survey also echoed this. And so the recommendations accordingly highlighted, roll on, roll off ferry networks, upgrading the Manila, Cebu, and Davao ports through public-private partnership-backed digital customs and infrastructure projects, and using resilience grants that are becoming a much more common financial mechanism to strengthen typhoon-exposed ports such as Tacloban. Another example, perhaps, let's say taking Thailand, which has a different context compared to the Philippines. It's a regional trade hub, and its economy relies on efficient land and maritime corridors. So the stakeholders here had ranked that rail expansion and intermodal terminals would be among their top 3 priorities. And the report reflects this by recommending rail upgrades on the Bangkok and Nong Khai and Bangkok Chiang Mai routes, and multimodal integration from the Lam Chabang port, or linking rail and inland waterways. So it also calls, in addition to just looking at the infrastructure, hard infrastructure, as well as soft measures, also thinks about the sort of investment opportunity. So and what the role for private sector is. So calls on private sector to invest in logistic parks and more bonded warehouses, and using real-time freight monitoring to have predictive maintenance, and also use that to help with accounting for weather predictions, and in particular, like landslide-prone corridors. So yeah, I think these are 2 examples of different contexts. But Nick, I don't know if you want to add here.
Yeah, maybe I can just speak a bit more broadly, but this study was focused on all 10 countries that are a part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. And there's just an incredible heterogeneity within that region of different countries, and the kind of current status and the challenges that they face when it comes to logistics and freight transport. So consider that you have Singapore, which is a very small country, but arguably perhaps the most advanced country in the world when it comes to shipping connections and maritime logistics. But you also have countries like Laos, which is completely landlocked and quite mountainous, and has a lot of room to improve, I think, in terms of connections with its neighbors, in order to really take advantage of the kind of domestic economy and connectivity within the region. And then, on another hand, you have Indonesia, which is one of the largest countries in the world by population, has a huge landmass, but is made up of hundreds of islands that have quite a difference in terms of their connectivity with each other. So one thing we really wanted to focus on in this report was providing location-specific policy recommendations, right? Not just general sort of advice to the whole region, because we knew that those things would be adopted to greater or lesser extents depending on the country's needs. So together we worked on developing really specific and geographically influenced policy recommendations that we think would have benefits for all the countries in the region.
Thank you very much, both. We still have time for some more questions. Please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window if you'd like to explore any other aspects of this report. There's a question which is interested in what we are calling the 3 pillars of the report. So that's connectivity, decarbonisation, and resilience, where they can be quite complementary, but where there are also trade-offs. There's a question on any examples of specific trade-offs or specific complements in any of those 10 countries that we're exploring in this project.
Yeah, perhaps I can take this one. I'm glad we got to dive into this a little bit further, because we showed that very complex chart, but didn't, have enough time to really get into the details. But I should just note before beginning that this was actually largely based on the work of Dr. Alan McKinnon at CUNY Logistics University, who developed that chart and the kind of thinking behind it for one of our methodological papers in the study. And I would encourage you to read the full paper as well, which is available at the links that Ronan has been sharing. But Dr. McKinnon identified 35 different links between the 3 pillars: connectivity, decarbonization, and resilience. And I think the good news is that most of them are complementary, meaning that when you make efforts to improve connectivity, often you are improving decarbonization as well. And likewise goes for the other pairs of the 3 pillars. So I think one example of a complementary effect is how improving port efficiency can reduce delays at the ports. And so that helps to improve connectivity by making it less expensive and less timely to ship goods from one region to another. But it also improves decarbonization because it helps to eliminate the carbon emissions that are associated with idle time while waiting for an available berth at anchor at the port. So this is one of the reasons why we recommend trying to improve the operational efficiency at the Port of Manila through automation and digitalizing customs documents to reduce waiting times, because it does have that strong complementary effect. But it is also important that policymakers recognize that there are trade-offs involved in a lot of cases too. So, for example, improving the cross-border connectivity at a road border crossing, might reduce waiting times and reduce costs, and therefore shift some of the freight transport from existing rail connection towards that new and improved road connection. And that would have, negative impact on decarbonization, at least in the current state, because road transport is generally much more carbon intensive than rail transport. But in this case, understanding those trade-offs is important, and also introducing complementary measures that can help to diffuse those trade-offs, I think, is also really key. So one thing that you could do in the example that I gave is introduce incentives for electric road freight vehicles, so that if you're reducing the carbon intensity of that road freight transport, you're helping to avoid worsening carbon emissions. But you could also simultaneously improve the road and the rail connections or cross-border connections, and therefore you might not necessarily see that modal shift. So we take exactly this approach actually in our report, where we recommend in Thailand to improve the electrification of road freight and rail freight to try to avoid some of those trade-offs involved with improvements to the road network.
Thanks indeed, Nick. And there's questions on, there's still time for a few questions if you would like to use the Q&A, the question and answer function. A specific question on the resilience aspect, which is ever more a hot topic for our member countries at ITF. And how did this report future-proof or stress test the resilience in this area? So what would actually happen in terms of major disruptions, be they geopolitical, climate influenced, etc.? So how did you guys work on that in the modeling to see what the actual effects of shocks would be?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think I can take this one as well. But feel free to jump in if you'd like. So I'm really glad we got the chance to talk about this as well, because it actually kind of didn't quite make the cut for the 10-slide presentation, but it is, I think, a really important element of the work that we did. So as I shared in one of the slides about the modeling scenarios, we also wanted to include a scenario where we evaluated the resilience impacts of some connectivity and decarbonization policies. And so what we first did was reached out to the governments of the countries involved in this study and explored with them what sort of disruptions are most likely to occur or that they're most concerned about occurring in the region. And what we found was that it's typically extreme weather events that have the greatest disruption in the region, at least for many of the countries in the eastern portion of Southeast Asia, where typhoons can have a significant impact and force the closure of ports, which are really sort of the lifeline of the regional trade. So we wanted to include a case study that examined, potential disruptions from ports to see whether the connectivity improvements or the decarbonization improvements that we're recommending would help to kind of defray some of those increasing costs that might occur when certain ports are closed. But we didn't want to just kind of come up with a situation out of whole cloth. So we reached out to one of our collaborators on this project, Professor Jasper Verschoor at TU Delft, who studies the risks of port disruption based on climate impacts. And so we looked at which ports are the most likely to be affected by extreme weather in the region. And we found that the typical pattern is that typhoons will occur sort of in the Philippine Sea in the eastern part of the region and move west across the Philippines and also have impacts on Thailand and occasionally Cambodia as well. And so our flexible modeling scenario allowed us to actually sort of program this type of scenario into the model so that we could actually look at what happens when you remove those ports or their capacity to import and export goods and how that would increase cost across the region. And so this was, you can find the results in the final report, but I wrote down some of the figures here just to make sure that I get them right. And what we saw there was that in Vietnam, under the business as usual scenario, this kind of disruption would cause costs to go up by 17% if those ports were disrupted, but only 13% in the connectivity scenario. And similarly for Thailand, rather than a 12% increase in costs, if those connectivity and decarbonization policy measures were introduced, you would only see an 8% increase in costs under disruption. And this generally occurs because we're addressing capacity bottlenecks in the network and making it easier to transition goods between different modes so that when the ports are disrupted, it's easier to reroute goods to a different port that is unaffected or switch to a different mode that might make transport easier, especially on the mainland where you have the availability of road and rail connections. So again, this analysis is really laid out with a lot of road and rail in the a lot of quantitative results in the report, and I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in that scenario.
Thank you indeed, Nick. We have a question from Michael Gildea, who asks, what would some of the solutions available to aggregate LTLs into FTLs for multiple fleet operators? So FTLs, full truckloads versus less than truckload for fleet operators. Are we able to take that question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And while we didn't get necessarily quite into that level of detail in the report, one thing that we did include in our policy measures in the connectivity scenario in particular was to introduce measures related to asset sharing, which is, I think, exactly what you're referring to. So having assets that are shared between operators so that you might have a truckload that contains shipments from several different shippers or consignees. And so that way you're able to take advantage of the efficiency improvements by having, multiple shipments in one vehicle. And we also looked at high capacity vehicles and the impact that that would have. So the way that our model works is that when we introduce those policy measures, we assume that there is an associated increase in load factors for trucks. And so then we can see what the impact of that is on the different performance measures that we included as part of our modeling outputs. So we did include that in our modeling scenarios, and we think that asset sharing, often supported by the government initiatives, by investing in facilities that could be shared between freight operators, is certainly an important policy and part of the policy mix that we think can contribute to better performance.
Thanks indeed, Nick. Am I right in thinking there are more resources in the project page methodology aspect on this? Okay, I will pop that link back into the chat for you. We've time just for one more question, I think, which is on the different policy priorities about connectivity. The question is about the stakeholder survey. It's looking at expert views on policy priorities. And were there significant differences between those countries, or are countries generally aligned in what their priorities are in the region?
Yeah, perhaps Varun, did you want to take this one?
Yeah, sorry. So I think, the stakeholder survey showed us like two key things. I think one, that there's regional priorities, but there's also national differences in what the stakeholders see. So at a regional level, the stakeholders do agree on the basics when it looks at connectivity. So they all or 70% of the stakeholders prioritize reducing border and intermodal delays, but not all of them do have current policies that enable this. And another regional agreement was looking at improving road quality and port capacity, which are two that are particularly important for the region to align on. But I think there are some contrasts that you can see from the survey respondents when it comes to each of the firstly looking at the focus countries, but also some of the other countries. So, for example, in the Philippines, because of its geography, the importance of natural disasters is one of the top connectivity risks, and they had considered, or the stakeholders have considered, digitalization of freight systems as a top priority. In Indonesia, the survey highlighted the importance of road quality. So majority of the respondents had rated that road maintenance and improvement would be their top priority. And this is mainly in Java and Sumatra, the top sort of big main land transport. And they also had identified that some of the sustainability tools are underutilized. So there's potential to leverage that. And looking beyond sort of the focus countries, Cambodia had, for example, identified that rail expansion is their priority for rail expansion was higher than the regional average. So it also shows that there's so that they want to revitalize or improve the current network in it. And in Vietnam, similar to Philippines, digitalization and logistics optimization was a top priority amongst the stakeholders. So whilst there is general consensus, I think because of the geography of the Southeast Asian countries, there were different priorities that came out. And in the in-depth stakeholder survey report, which is published separately at the end of last year, that has country-specific results also showcased, whereas the overarching report that has been shared in this chat also has a more regional average that consolidates that.
Thank you very much indeed, Varun. We're actually over time, excuse me. So I want to just let you know that we have another Ask the Author coming up again next week, next Tuesday. We're moving to the East Africa region. We're using the same modeling capacity, the in-house modelings of the ITF for results on this project. There's also a West Africa project underway. If you'd like to join us and find out more about that, click on the link. You can get the report and then join us next Tuesday. We mentioned resilience is an ever important topic, and the ITF run, as you probably know, the International Transport Forum's annual summit every May in Leipzig, which is the premier transport policy event worldwide. Next year's edition will be the second in a trilogy on resilience, focusing on funding. So funding resilient transport. There's a link and there's information coming on how to get involved in the summit as early as next week. And I'll just leave you with links to our newsletters and our social media channels. So I'd like to thank very much Nick Caros and Varun Shankar for excellent work and excellent presentation, and you all for your participation and your questions. So thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you online soon for another Ask the Author. Take good care.